The history of hot yoga from our spiritual origins all the way to modern day times. Now, I happen to be an expert at hot yoga, but this transition affected all of yoga. Many yoga practitioners are unaware of the historical and philosophical aspects of yoga. That's why I wanted to make this video. Now, if you go to a yoga school or a yoga studio outside of India in the West, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be doing yogic postures or asana. This is what we've referred to in modern day times as postural yoga. I opened my studio. I was one of the pioneers in this country. I opened my studio in 1983. It was during the aerobics craze, the whole Jane Fonda, Kathy Smith aerobics craze. And I saw a transition take place because a lot of the aerobics teachers were injuring themselves and coming to my class. They went from high impact to low impact to no impact. Eventually, they all came to yoga.
I was waiting for you.
That was a transition that happened recently. But let's go back to our spiritual origins because it's important to understand how the historical part of yoga transitioned to modern day times. A very brief history lesson. 6,000 years ago, people were suffering. They went to the shamans. The shamans were the first ones to intuit the subject of yoga, and they saw that people were suffering because they were under the illusion that they're separate beings. They then intuited the science of yoga, and that's why they chose the word yoga, to yoke, to create a union between man and God. The spiritual intention is the original intention of yoga. So how do we end up just doing yogic postures or asana and calling that yoga? Let's talk about how that transition took place. Now, there are many styles of yoga that practice the yogic asana. They have their own interpretation of the subject. But there are 2 main styles of yoga that I believe, in my opinion, are the most popular. Therefore, more illustrating the point of why the transition took place in the West, in modern day times. The 2 styles of yoga that I'm talking about, there are really many styles within the 2 styles. The first one is what I call the Krishnamacharyans. Krishnamacharya was a very famous yoga teacher. He had 3 main disciples or students. Iyengar, so Iyengar yoga is in this category. Pattabhi Jois, who created his version of Ashtanga yoga, and his son Desikachar. And his philosophy was Vinyasa. The Vinyasa style came out of this particular umbrella, this particular style of yoga. The second, what I consider to be one of the most popular styles of yoga, is the hot yoga world. And the main guy was Vishnu Ghosh. Vishnu Ghosh created this style of hot yoga. Bikram then brought hot yoga in the late 1970s to the United States. I became Bikram's most senior teacher for 18 years, creating the Barkan method. So the hot yoga world, also extremely popular. These 2 styles of yoga are postural yoga, very different in their approach. The hot yoga obviously uses heat, but we have different alignment concepts. Sometimes we have different names for poses. The hot yoga world came from the north, up in Bengal. The Krishnamacharyans came from the south in Mysore. However, what's interesting about these 2 is they have very similar roots and how their particular style of yoga was created. Let's go to Krishnamacharya first. Krishnamacharya's yoga studio was adjacent to a gymnasium. He was extremely influenced by gymnastics. So a lot of the jump throughs and the jump backs that you find in Vinyasa, a lot of the arm balancings that you'll see in an Ashtanga class came from a gymnastics background, not so much a yogic background. So he took the dynamic of the athleticism, the gymnastics, and incorporated it into the yogic postures. Now for Vishnu Ghosh, he taught gymnastics. Also very influenced by gymnastics, very influenced by the Chinese acrobats, and he used that as an influence to create his style of yoga. So you can see the gymnastics in modern day athletics played an extremely important role in how yoga has developed to modern day times. Now, before Krishnamacharya and before Vishnu Ghosh, they weren't even calling standing poses asana, because asana literally doesn't mean posture. It's really symbolized by the word posture. It means seat. The yogi takes his meditation seat. So Patanjali in his 8-limb path, the 3rd limb is asana, so the yogi could sit for long periods of time in meditation to quiet the mind. Patanjali's yoga, classical yoga, was about quieting the mind, not about developing the body in vinyasa and exercise, not about using the body to heal, which was Vishnu Ghosh's main thing, to use yoga as a healing modality. They called the standing poses back then, before Vishnu Ghosh and Krishnamacharya, they called them tapas. They would stand on one leg for a long period of time to show the guru their devotion. But when Krishnamacharya and Vishnu Ghosh came along, and they started to bring in the gymnastic aspect and the physicality of the yogic postures, they started calling the standing positions postures or asana. And that's what people in the West gravitated to. The United States and Europe and South America and Australia, we gravitated to the athleticism and the physicality that the yogic postures provided. And like I said before, we went from the high impact aerobics to doing yogic postures. It was much easier on the body. We could measure results very quickly, and the phenomenon of modern day postural yoga took off. Now, there's one person in yoga history I did not mention yet, which is very important in the subject. If we look at the timeline, yoga was 6,000 years ago. The beginning of yoga was 6,000 years ago. Patanjali was 2,000 years ago. But 1,000 years ago, somewhere around the year 1100, was a very influential yogi named Goraksha. And Goraksha came up with the 84 poses. Theoretically, there's 8,400,000 yogic asanas, variations of all these different poses, but there are 84 basic ones. Now, if you're in the hot yoga world, you might have seen a poster of Tony Sanchez. He does what he calls classical 84 poses. And you may have also seen a poster of Isaac Garcia doing the same 84 poses. They represented was that these were the original 84 poses passed down by Goraksha, but that's not true. Because like I said before, the standing poses, which are a big part of what's on the poster, Tony's and Isaac's poster, were not part of the original 84 poses. The original 84 poses were seated poses, postures that yogi can find as meditation, floor poses to keep the spine nice and flexible and strong, like the cobra and the locust and the bow. The seated postures and the floor postures were all part of the original 84. Now back to the spiritual origin, because the spiritual origin of yoga was all about meditation and breathing techniques that the yogis intuited to teach their students so they could then find the yoke, the union between man and the universe, man and God. And what was interesting back then was that they had all these different techniques that they would hold on to, and a lot of times they would disagree with each other. They'd make the other styles of yoga wrong, which is not a very yogic philosophy, right? Because yoga is all about union. That was sort of a dichotomy. Same thing now in modern day times. We have all these different styles of yoga. In fact, I did a video recently about what's wrong with yoga today, and that's the judgment. So watch this video after you watch this one. It's about the judgment that we have, that one thinks that their yoga is the right way and that yoga is the wrong way. If you don't want to do that style of yoga, just don't do it. Why make the judgment? Why make them wrong? One of the pioneers in yoga in the United States, way before me, was a woman named Lilias Folan. She was on PBS, on the public television stations back in the 70s, and she would do a very gentle style of yoga. She would do Little Mermaid pose and puppy pose and happy baby. And if you ever took a live class with Lilias, you could not applaud her because it was too loud. You could only do angel claps. Angel claps for Lilias Folan. I love Lilias Folan. In fact, I was honored to write an endorsement for her last book. The point I'm making is it's not the style of yoga that I'm drawn to, but I'm not going to make one wrong for doing that style of yoga if that's what they're drawn to. Why make the judgment? But the point of this video is that it's important to understand the historical philosophical origins of yoga, because all the way up until present day time, at least until it migrated to the West, the techniques that the yogis were teaching their students in their ashram were techniques to find the union with God. There's one very famous yogi, he's got a lot of YouTube videos. His name is Yogi Raj Siddhanath. He said man's only goal should be finding God. One of my favorite sayings is that in order for us to know where we're going, we have to know where we came from. The transition of yoga, the timeline from the traditionalist to Patanjali to Goraksha to Krishnamacharya and Vishnu Ghosh, and how the postural yoga became so popular in the West because we were drawn to that physicality. So most people come to yoga studios to get more flexible, to get strong, to ease stress, to quiet the mind. When we start to bring in the spiritual aspect, which is really the third part, the physical, mental, and the spiritual, then it comes back to full circle. And I believe it can elevate your yogic journey to its fullest expression. So that's our episode for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing, hit the notification bell. Any questions or comments, put them down below. I'm happy to get back to you, and I will see you at the next video. Bye, everyone.